The mutual dependence of climate, human societies, ecosystem and biodiversity is a concept that must be understood to evaluate the impacts and risks of non-climatic global trends such as biodiversity loss, human demographic shifts, land and ecosystem degradation. In our current era, it is more important than ever to assess the risks and impacts of climate change and what action we must take to transition to a climate-resilient development. This video is based on the summary for policymakers from the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Work Group 2. This report tracks the consequences on people and ecosystem resulting from human-induced climate change, what can be changed and what is already irreversible. Unfortunately, this report is very concerning, yet nothing contains is new. So how bad is it? Well, the long and short of it is that everybody will be affected in different ways, but not equally. 45% of the global population lives in these highly vulnerable contexts to climate change, and the ongoing unsustainable development patterns only increases their exposure. Basically, the more climate change progresses, the more it becomes self-induced, exacerbating even more the already growing impacts. Resource extraction, unsustainable land use, pollution and social inequities are all factors responsible and affected by climate change at the same time. We can find in this report links between climate change and humanitarian crisis, food insecurity, water scarcity, migration and premature death. This chart is the bread and butter of this report. On the left-hand side, we see the different scenarios for temperatures that go between success at drastically reducing CO2 emissions or what happens if we change nothing of our modes of consumption. On the right-hand side, the IPCC has sorted the possible events into 5 categories, from local impacts like loss of unique ecosystem to global impacts like sea level rising. At our current level of global warming around 1 degree, the system gives us an appreciation of its scale with moderate risks in about every category. This translates to what we have already observed so far with the melting of the North Pole, massive coral death and sea level rising above certain islands already. So far, humans have mostly been able to adapt to these impacts, but rely heavily on fossil fuels to do so. Sadly, if we remain in this trend, the impact will become greater and greater, while our ability to adapt will become weaker and weaker. This is one of the many tragedies of global warming, as to protect ourselves from these consequences of CO2 emission, we have to emit even more CO2 to build these projects. 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperature is when shit hits the fan, which, mind you, is only 0.5 degrees away from our current situation. It paints a very clear and bleak image of the risks of going above 1.5 degrees, with extreme weather events becoming common, premature mortality caused by diseases and heat, episodes of wildfire, floods and droughts, just as an example. This is what the report is all about. The risks we thought would happen way higher on the temperature scale are now shown to be much closer than we anticipated. Unique and threatened systems are already at very high risk even below 2 degrees, and everything accelerates beyond that point to a high or very high risk of vulnerability. And we are still very far away from a climate-resilient society. Now that everyone is on board with the risks, what are the solutions to protect ecosystems and ourselves? Adaptation is key to achieving a climate-resilient development, and countries have already started to adopt climate policies and adaptation measures. It will take different forms based on what are the risks exposed to, from anti-flood barriers on the coast against storms and hurricanes, and better water management in dry areas to prevent droughts. Again, none of these are new, but because of climate change, these events will become bigger and more often, and we must prepare. Despite the efforts made to set up these actions, a gap remains with the level of adaptation required to fully counter these impacts and reduce the risks. Institution tends to stay on a short term with shiny solution rather than implementing long-term flexible and community-centered measures. The more exposed area of this planet are also the ones that receive the least amount of funding and help. It is better to treat people where they are instead of waiting for them to become desperate. What should we remember from this? The goal is clear: we need to change the system that runs our society to reduce the inequalities and reduce the impact of global warming. We can pull the levers of adaptability for a while, but it will become more and more expensive as we do so if we do not reduce our emissions. The evidence of observed impact and future risks prove that the transition is more than urgent. What has been done in the past cannot be changed, and we must face that some pathways of this development are closed. Acceptable outcomes are still open, but they are closing, and closing quickly. The decisions of today will determine the path we take tomorrow. Good luck.